In this video, I discussed my PhD, which was about hip-hop and breaking culture in New York, Osaka, and Perth. So for those who don't know, a PhD, which stands for Doctor of Philosophy, is essentially a research project in which you're tasked with having to complete a thesis between 80 to 100,000 words. And one's thesis is meant to be this significant or new contribution to knowledge within a specific academic field of study. They typically take between 4 to 5 years to complete, and once you submit one, it's examined by 2 external examiners who ultimately have to decide whether it is a significant contribution to knowledge or not. So my PhD was 84,000 words in length and 272 pages long. It had 9 chapters and it was titled Our Lives Are Lived in Freestyle, the Social and Dynamic Productions of Breaking and Hip-Hop Culture. So the title of my thesis, Our Lives Are Lived in Freestyle, was a line from a spoken word poem by a breaker from Texas named Marlon.
Foundation is funk, jazz, soul, we rebel, we are rebels. Our lives are lived in freestyle, and gravity be the enemy, and impossible be the enemy, and my feet will never let me taste defeat, cause I'm so deep in the concrete that Mother Earth moves with me. I swear, Ma, she grooves with me. And my life is lived in freestyle. I've been called a bad man, I've been turned down, I've been turned away, and today I know what sacrifice means, and I also know that family can be called a crew, a squad, a tribe, and I also learn to move. And from that movement came flow, and from that flow came flight. Look, Ma, I can fly, I'm flying, and I compete to be complete, I compete to be complete.
See, in hip-hop, to freestyle means to improvise in the moment, and many breakers tend to freestyle when they're dancing. You know, they're reacting to the situation at hand, the music, the floor, the vibe, the people around them. And as hip-hop is such a globally diverse and dynamic cultural world, I argued that around the world, different hip-hop practitioners are freestyling, they're improvising and creating hip-hop culture in ways that are local and unique. The research I conducted looked primarily at breakdancers, or breakers as it's more commonly described by those who do it. For those that don't know, breaking is a popular hip-hop dance practice that originated in New York City around the early to mid-1970s. It had young African American, Caribbean, and Latino peoples playing a central role in its origins and historical development. And despite its constant presence within popular culture for the last 40 plus years, it always surprises me how little people know about this dance and where it comes from and who its early contributors were. See, back when I was 13 years old in 1999, some friends and I from high school went to a breaking class in Subiaco, which is in my hometown of Perth. And it was here that I became really hooked on breaking. And for the past 20 years, I've continued to break, entering jams and with some success in a number of large international breaking competitions. But working on a PhD that was writing about breaking and hip-hop, I had to write to an academic discipline. So it wasn't breakers who were going to judge my thesis, it was these professors and experienced anthropologists who most likely didn't even care or have an interest in breaking or hip-hop for that matter. And you might be thinking,
what the f*** is anthropology?
And that's a good question. And if you've ever Googled or typed that question into YouTube, you'll get a whole load of very boring and vague explanations that usually begin with someone listing off a bunch of anthropology subfields like archaeology and linguistics and biological blah blah blah. Then, after you suffer through this, if you even make it that far, the person telling you what they think to be this non-jargon definition of anthropology would typically say something like,
anthropology is always going to be relevant. Anthropology is always going to be interested in the now, because the now has history. And that, if anything else, is kind of the main tenet of anthropology. How do we understand how we got to now? How do we make sense of what things mean now? They don't come from a vacuum. They don't exist in a vacuum, rather.
So did you get that? Anthropology is about how do we make sense of what things mean now. And seriously, come on, that is no help at all. How do you even study something like that? These vague definitions, they don't make any sense, and they're not helpful to people who haven't spent years studying anthropology. And nor is it, I think, very accurate of what anthropologists actually do. So yeah, you could say that anthropologists study culture or society or something else super vague like that, which doesn't really give people a clue of what anthropology is or does. Instead, I think it's better to say what anthropologists actually do, which is something my PhD supervisor, Professor Philip Moore, often would talk about. He would say, what anthropologists do is they write. But before they begin writing, they tend to go out into the world, gather evidence, either through conducting interviews or simply hanging out with people for an extended period of time, which is what anthropologists call ethnography, and they gain a deeper sense of the people and the cultures in which they're planning to write about. Ethnography is also a way to build relationships and connections with people in the field, which in turn become part of your anthropological analysis. Anthropology also has many objectives and aims. The anthropologist Tim Ingold did an interview recently about a book he wrote, which was titled Anthropology, Why It Matters, and he listed off some of these objectives really nicely.
There's one objective which is to describe and maybe analyse the way of life for a particular people in a particular place in a particular time. That's one objective, and that's an ethnographic objective, to give a description of the life of a people. There's another thing, which is to explore the conditions, and through a speculative comparative inquiry into what are the conditions and possibilities of human life in the world. That's a different sort of thing, and I think that's what anthropology is really about. I've called it a long definition, is that anthropology is a generous, open-ended, comparative, and yet critical exploration of the conditions and possibilities of human life in the world.
One of the main arguments I made in the thesis was that because hip-hop doesn't have a central authority, because there isn't one person, group, or institution that has the final word to say what is or isn't hip-hop, that there's a power and agency that's afforded to individuals who engage in hip-hop. That hip-hop practitioners have the capacity to be able to influence and shape hip-hop in ways that just doesn't happen in other cultures. For instance, let's take ballet as an example of another global dance culture. Ballet is a world that is heavily organised and managed by various institutions. You've got the Royal Ballet School in London, Juilliard in New York, and the Vaganova Ballet Academy in St. Petersburg, Russia. All of these companies play an important role in educating and organising how ballet is understood, expressed, whereas in hip-hop, it's a world of many individuals, some of which are more influential than others. Now, of course, this leads to all sorts of tensions and debates about what is true and authentic and legitimate in hip-hop. And rather than making any claims myself about what's real or authentically hip-hop, I travelled to different places and chatted with a bunch of different breakers, different pioneers and OGs, and I wrote about how they made sense of and negotiated these questions of identity and authority and history. And in doing so, I ended up discussing about how across different hip-hop scenes, that the people who engage in hip-hop, whether it's through breaking or rapping or graffiti, are all involved in an ongoing cultural process, one of reinvention, and that this is happening all over the world between different groups of people who speak vastly different languages, and each of whom stumble upon hip-hop in vastly different ways and at different times. And so my thesis, therefore, aimed to emphasise the dynamic and diverse and highly contested nature of hip-hop culture. And yes, there are problems of power, of gender, of race, of whose voices are heard in hip-hop and whose are not. In my thesis, I drew from hip-hop scholars like Flores, who had written extensively on the forgetting and sidelining of hip-hop's Latin American cultural origins, histories, and influences. And this, of course, is happening also to hip-hop's African American origins and influences. I tried to make the case that hip-hop is a globalizing and diverse cultural field, governed not by institutions, offices, or titles, but rather by individual hip-hop practitioners, within and across different local and social settings. My study on hip-hop aimed to contribute towards anthropological writings on culture, process, agency, and social action. Additionally, my research also aimed at contributing towards a growing body of hip-hop scholarship, a field that's tended to focus primarily on rap music, and I think that by engaging with the lives and experiences of breakers, I avoided some of the shortcomings of other hip-hop studies that have taken a more structural approach and privileged theory at the expense of what's said and done in the field. I hope you enjoyed this discussion about my PhD, and if you're interested in reading it, I must warn you it's pretty long, but I've posted a link to it in the description below. Till next time.